And we'll turn now to book 2. And book 2 is this incredible depiction of the fall of Troy. And I really urge you to read. If you read nothing else, I think you'll get a lot out of book 2, in the sense that, well, we've talked about the Iliad and how that shows everything up to the death of Hector. And then this is the great depiction that we have of the events afterwards. It's the great depiction of the events of the Trojan Horse, and then of what happens when the Greeks take over Troy. So in book 2, well, so I think for that reason it might be interesting for you, but also just because of the haunting scenes. There are very memorable scenes that are portrayed there, and I'll try to give you a sense of them here. But like I said, I think it warrants reading yourself. And haunting scenes that will, I'm sure, live with you after you've read them. So in book 2, Aeneas provides his first-person account of the Trojan Horse and the sack of Troy, and this, along with book 3, are direct parallels to in the Odyssey, the Homeric epic we didn't read, books 9 to 12, where Odysseus recounts or narrates his previous adventures to the Phaeacians. So they're narrated in parallel circumstances. So each is in the court of a monarch who will offer assistance. So the Phaeacians, Alcinous is the king there, and he's offering assistance to Odysseus and eventually helps him get back to Ithaca. And in each court, there's an implicit offer of marriage to the hero, which would cause them to stay and not achieve their final return to home, or in the case of Aeneas, their new home. So this implicit offer of marriage has to be, let's say, denied. And in both, the hero's visit has a disastrous consequence for the host. So in the case of the Phaeacians, Poseidon, after he hears that the Phaeacians helped, so Poseidon is the god that hates Odysseus and is preventing him from returning home, and he finds out that the Phaeacians aided him to return to Ithaca, and he wipes out their island vengefully. And obviously the consequences for Dido and the Carthaginians we've talked about. So she kills herself. She's in incredible sorrow, curses the Romans and Carthaginians, and by proclaiming an eternal enmity between the two peoples. So on the right, we have an artistic depiction of Odysseus at the court of Alcinous, and the content of the two stories corresponds in a lot of ways. They both begin with Troy and end how they arrived in that court, and include a lot of Aeneas's wanderings in book 3. So we're not going to talk about that too much, but the wanderings that he describes in book 3, often he follows the same path of Odysseus with minor changes, right? Like he goes and sees the Cyclops, but he's not mean to the Cyclops. So in each case, he follows Odysseus, but rewrites Odysseus and becomes, let's say, a better Odysseus, becomes a better hero, a newer and better version of the hero. Odysseus's narrative so focuses on his own cleverness and skill in avoiding death, and Aeneas's focuses on the sorrows he's endured and the necessity imposed on him by fate. So he begins his narrative with, "Sorrow, unspeakable sorrow, my queen, you ask me to bring to life once more." So that's how he starts his narrative, whereas Odysseus's narrative is almost a triumphant. Oh yeah, well, yeah, that's a great story. We did this, and boy, and now I was so smart, I got out of this, and then we did that, and us and me and the men, we were so heroic. So quite a different tone and to the two stories. Odysseus's story begins after the fall of Troy, whereas Aeneas spends basically half of his story, all of book 2, on describing the sack of Troy. So obviously for a Trojan perspective, there's more grist to describe there, and as opposed to the exploits of the journey. So the Trojan horse. So we've all probably heard of this, at least to some extent, what this Trojan horse is. We've heard about this story. So the Greeks build this wooden horse, and they fill it with their best warriors, and they then sail to this island Tenedos that's just off the mainland of what is now Turkey, near Troy, right? And to hide their ships behind this island, and the Trojans assume that the Greeks have left for home, but they're unsure what to do with this horse, and they're struggling. They're arguing with one another, and this arguing, I would say, would remind the Virgilian reader of the civil strife that is the background of the Aeneid. So the 100 years of civil war. So we have the line in the Aeneid: the common people are split into warring factions. I think is echoing this civil war in the background of the Aeneid. And then Laocoon, in case you're wondering how to pronounce that person's name, that's how I've heard it pronounced by people smarter than me, is a priest of Neptune, and he advises against accepting the horse, famously saying, "I fear the Greeks even when bearing gifts." Okay. The shepherds then bring in a Greek captive, Sinon, as they discuss these issues. So if they had listened to Laocoon, they wouldn't have brought the horse in, and it would be a different story altogether, right? They then bring in this captive. They find the shepherds have found this Greek person named Sinon, and they bring him in, and this is just in the midst of this discussion, and this is what sways them. So Sinon is telling a lying story. Sinon is a plant by the Greeks just to fool the Trojans, right? So according to Sinon, the Greeks received an oracle from Apollo demanding a human sacrifice. Now Ulysses, so that's the Roman name for Odysseus. Ulysses hates Sinon, so he was chosen as the victim, right? So Sinon said, okay, forget that, and he escaped and ran away. They couldn't find him. He's hiding in some bush, I guess. And then the Greeks took off without him, and then he was found by these Trojan shepherds. So Sinon then says the Greeks left to garner the favor of the gods and get reinforcements. And the horse that he says is an offering to Athena, or Minerva is the Roman name, to compensate her for the Greeks' theft of a statue during a raid of the city. So Sinon provides a plausible, let's say, story for why the Greeks left this horse there as a votive offering to Minerva. So the Trojans believe Sinon. And why? Because, well, maybe because they're honest and they pity him, okay? And they're compassionate. And their downfall, if we think about it, is caused by these good qualities. So they want to, so first there's a couple of things going on. The Romans are countering, let's say, a Greek approach, they're distinguishing themselves from the Greeks, which is based on deception and lying from themselves, who, like the Trojans, could fall for that only because they're compassionate and honest people, okay? So that's one thing. The other thing would be that it's a warning perhaps against misplaced compassion, and it's a warning to sometimes be ruthless with an enemy. Okay, so maybe something to keep in mind when we think about the final scene with Aeneas and Turnus. So remember, we're not reading it, we're not going to closely analyze the lines, but we know the basic story, and it looms over the end of the story of what this last scene of him killing Turnus. So maybe the fate of the Trojans, misplaced compassion, can lead to your downfall. So just because you have someone like Turnus who's pleading to you at the end, maybe don't let them off the hook as the Trojans let the Greeks off the hook here. The Trojans are further motivated to believe Sinon because of the fate of Laocoon. So there's a famous sculpture here that resides in Vatican City of Laocoon and his sons, okay, being wrapped up by the serpent. So he's killed by these two. He's killed with his two sons by snakes that swim out of the sea and crush him. Okay, so this they were sent by the gods because the fate of Troy had to be sealed, right? Troy has to fall for the fate. And Laocoon's almost convincing the Trojans not to let this horse in. And the gods saying, no, the fate's, this is Troy's got to fall. So they made sure that Laocoon's dispensed with. And so this fate leads them to believe that Laocoon was speaking improperly, even though he was actually speaking the truth, and leads them to think that they should take the horse in. So what we see there is kind of again this double motivation. So there's the motivation of fate and, let's say, intervention with the gods, but also human action. So they were there's a fate that drives what happens to Troy, but also human-willed action that seems to drive them in the same direction. So one of the lines really underscores this in book 2. If fate and our own wits had not gone against us, surely Laocoon would have driven us on. So the Trojans break a hole in their walls so that they can wheel the giant horse into the city, thereby claiming the benefits from Minerva. And at night, of course, the Greeks come out of the horse and let their comrades who've sailed back from Tenedos into the city, and the sack of Troy has begun. At this point, the ghost of Hector appears to Aeneas in a dream and tells him that Troy's end has come, and Hector tells Aeneas to flee and to take his family and the household gods. They're called the Penates, so these household gods, these figures that were worshipped as part of family religious ritual, the household gods of Troy, and get out of there so that they can be preserved, that his family and the household gods can be preserved. Aeneas climbs to a rooftop from which he's able to survey the destruction, and he grabs his weapons and runs out to the street to fight. And the point seems to be here that in this depiction of him trying to fight, that there is a time for martial bravery, but in certain circumstances, it can be irrational. So in this case, the fight is completely lost, and it's irrational to fight back. And the words of Hector guiding him to get out of there with his family are the rational course of action. So these lines here again from book 2: the Sigean straits shimmering back the blaze, the shouting of fighters soars, the clashing blare of trumpets. Out of my wits, I seize my arms. What reason for arms? So remember, this is Aeneas narrating the story. So the narrator at this point, it's a narration within the narration. So the I in this case is Aeneas. Just my spirit burning to muster troops for battle, rush with comrades up to the city's heights. Fury and rage driving me breakneck on as it races through my mind. What a noble thing it is to die in arms. So this is an irrational thing going through his mind at this point, that it's a noble thing to die in arms. Sometimes maybe it is, according to this point of departure, but at this point it's underscored that very martial sentiment. What's being underscored here is that it was irrational at this point, that thinking, being driven by this notion that it's noble to die in arms, didn't make sense. Why? Because he had a duty to the future. He had a duty to his family. He had to protect his family. He had to get them out of there. He had to protect a future line that had a destiny to found Rome. And for all these reasons, in a way, it was irresponsible. And often it would it could be portrayed as a heroic thing in a Hollywood movie to go out there guns blazing against impossible odds, but it would in a kind of a more sober analysis, it could be seen as irrational. So the narrator, this time Aeneas himself, undercuts the speech of Aeneas. Like he's saying what he said to himself, and uh, uh, as he was trying to rally the Trojans, these other Trojans with him to fight the Greeks. Now, like a wolf pack out for blood on a foggy night, driven blindly on by relentless rabid hunger, leaving cubs behind, waiting, jaws parched. So, like a wolf pack that are so ravenous and maybe rabid, insane with blood thirstiness, they go out and they leave their cubs unattended. So too, he's going out on this kind of wild martial quest with other Trojans who he's rallied to try to fight the Greeks, when really he should be tending to the cubs, let's say the family. So he describes several horrifying scenes. He has an encounter with Helen, and then Venus comes to see him. So let's talk about some of the horrifying scenes, and we'll look a bit more closely at one of them. So I've just put a couple of the line numbers there for the Cassandra. He sees Cassandra being dragged away from a nervous temple in chains. And so what we know there from the stories around the fall of Troy is that she's being dragged out of the temple after she's just been raped, and she's being dragged into slavery for a miserable life. And then she's going to be killed when she returns at the hands of Clytemnestra. Okay, so we know Cassandra's fate, and it's not a good one. Like, she's suffering the worst, horrible fate right now. He sees the Greeks storming the royal palace, where Priam puts on his armor, and Hecuba begs him to take refuge at the household altar, and we'll look at that a bit. And he sees the murder of Priam's young son Polites, again before the parents' eyes, and he sees the murder of Priam himself. Okay. So if we turn to, one thing I'll note. So we'll turn to the description of the death of Priam. And the description of the death of Priam echoes, because he's putting the sword hilt deep into Priam. This is Achilles' son, actually. Pyrrhus does this, kills Priam. It's put hilt deep into Priam, and it echoes the death of Turnus. So Aeneas, at the end of the epic, Aeneas puts his sword hilt deep into Turnus as well. So I'm going to call up the actual text so we can look at that and go through this. So this is the depiction of Priam, the death of Priam, and the lead up to that. And maybe you ask, so remember, this is Aeneas describing this to the court of Dido, and others are listening. Maybe you ask, what was Priam's fate? When he saw the end of the captive city, the palace doors wrenched away, and the enemy among the inner rooms, the aged man clasped his long neglected armor on his old trembling shoulders and fastened on his useless sword, and hurried into the thick of the enemy seeking death. In the center of the halls and under the sky's naked arch was a large altar with an ancient laurel nearby that leant on the altar and clothed the household gods with shade. Here Hecuba and her daughters, like doves driven by a dark storm, crouched uselessly by the shrines. Okay, so there's all these, Priam's grabbing arms, but his sword is useless. Hecuba is trying to hide by an altar, hoping to seek their refuge, that no one will kill anyone, no one would commit the sacrilege to kill someone else at an altar. And this is all useless because of the bloodthirstiness of the Greeks here. They're killing regardless of whether someone's in a sanctuary, a religious sanctuary, by an altar. It doesn't matter. All of this is being neglected by this incredible, unspeakable destruction of Troy here. And when she saw Priam himself dressed in youthful armor, she cried, "What mad thought, poor husband, urges you to fasten on these weapons? Where do you run? The hour demands no such help, nor defenses such as these. Not if my own Hector were here himself. Here, I beg you, this altar will protect us all, or we'll die together. So this is Hecuba. This is Hector's mother and wife of Priam, and she's pleading with Priam to seek shelter at the altar, along with her and the daughters. And Hecuba, for those of you who've read Shakespeare's Hamlet, in the second act, he's talking about a play where, the lines are from Hecuba, and it's about this scene. It's about the scene. It's a play built on this scene, fall in Troy, the death of Priam and Hecuba at this altar, and the death of Priam at this altar, and Hamlet reacts, to this actor who's able to garner tears at these lines of Hecuba's, and says, "Who's Hecuba to he, or he to Hecuba?" So those famous lines of Hamlet are referring to this scene. So she spoke and drew the old man toward her. So we're right here now, and set him down on the sacred steps. See Polites, one of Priam's sons, escaping Pyrrhus's slaughter. So Polites, one of Priam's son, is running away from Pyrrhus, who's Achilles' son, okay? Runs down the long hallways, through enemies and spears, and wounded crosses the empty courts. Pyrrhus chases after him, eager to strike him, and grasps at him now, and now with his hand at spear point. When finally he reached the eyes and gaze of his parents, he fell and poured out his life in a river of blood. Priam, though even now in death's clutches, did not spare his voice at this, or hold back his anger. So this is Priam speaking. If there is any justice in heaven that cares about such things, may the gods repay you with fit thanks and due reward for your wickedness. For such acts you have made me see my own son's death in front of my face, and defiled a father's sight with murder. Yet Achilles, whose son you falsely claim to be, was no such enemy to Priam. He respected the suppliant's rights and honor, and returned Hector's bloodless corpse to its sepulcher, and sent me home to my kingdom. So he's referring to book 24 of the Iliad that we read there, right? So he's referring to no matter what Achilles did, he was not as bent on rage as this supposed son of Achilles, Pyrrhus. He respected a suppliant's right and returned Hector's body. He did not disrespect him in such a way. So the old man spoke, and threw his ineffectual spear, again so useless, without strength, which immediately spun from the clanging bronze and hung uselessly from the center of the shield's boss. Pyrrhus spoke to him. Then you can be messenger, carry the news to my father, to Peleus's son. Remember to tell him of degenerate Pyrrhus, and of my sad actions. Now die. Saying this, he dragged him, trembling, and slithering in the pool of his son's blood, to the very altar, and twined his left hand in his hair, raised the glittering sword in his right, and buried it to the hilt in his side. This was the end of Priam's life. This was the death that fell to him by lot. Seeing Troy ablaze and its citadel toppled, he who was once the magnificent ruler of so many Asian lands and peoples, a once mighty body lies on the shore, the head shorn from its shoulders, a corpse without a name. So again, haunting stuff there from book 2, and again, I think our takeaway from book 2 is about the horror of a couple of things. If we think about the theme of the course, so the horrors of siege warfare. So let's think about the horrors of siege warfare. So what we see in the literature as well as the history is that there's no kind of form of warfare that ends up being more brutal to innocent lives of family members of the eventually captured city, and this was well known in ancient times. It's well known in modern times, and we'll see, let's say, it's something we need to keep in mind in terms of Henry V's, when we get to Henry V's positive or mercy to Harfleur. Okay, he's been sieging Harfleur. He threatens them with a lot of violent action that we'll have to look at that speech. But then when he finally takes it over, is merciful to them. So there's the question of siege warfare. There's also this question of the reminders throughout the epic that this is the fate of Carthage at the hands of the Romans. So as you're listening to this, you're Virgil's audience, and you're a great Roman, and you're thinking, oh, those Greeks who did this to the Trojans, who were our forefathers and mothers, and well, we got them back. You know, the Aeneas settled in Italy, founded a new people, founded us. Now we rule the Greeks, and all has come full circle. So, you know, there's celebratory come-upmanship there. But there's also the echo that we Romans have also done this to Carthaginians. There's reminders that, you know, and we'll see at the end of book 4, kind of direct allusions to that this episode has led to the burning walls of Carthage, and that they too will suffer the same fate as these Trojans who we so sympathize with, and at whose hands? At our hands, us supposedly noble Romans. He then sees Helen and considers killing her. He's stopped by his mother Venus. She reminds him that his family's in danger. And she says, Helen and Paris are not to blame. It's the gods are responsible. She tears away the clouds that normally blind mortal sight or human sight to what's really going on. And she, by tearing away these clouds, this veil, he can see that there are gods tearing at the walls. So Neptune is there with his trident on the walls and breaking down the walls of Troy. And he sees, it emphasizes a couple things. Well, first of all, it emphasizes that to some extent, human agency is less important than we might think. It also emphasizes the inevitability of Troy, and it's a reminder to him that he's not going to be able to fight this. He's got to take care of what he can control, so to speak. He can try to protect his family. He can try to ensure his destiny of starting a new people in a new land. I have a note here too that in a way you could think about this act of tearing away the clouds as what the function of the poet's work, right? So in both Homer and Virgil, that's in a way what they're doing is someone might see that story, like any story, story of any war, the story of any battle, or the story of any love affair, whatever the story is, as just on the human level, and might just see it on the material level, and might just see it as actions of earthly beings in conflict and maybe reconciling. And what the poet's trying to do is showing other higher forces at work, how it's tied to the larger movement of the cosmos, the gods, fate, how it's part of a larger whole. And this is kind of, as I said, symbolized, or almost kind of, we have a glimpse of that kind of functioning of the poet's work when Venus shows what's going on with the fall of Troy. Now Aeneas, book 2 is closing now, and he finds his family and leaves the city. He takes his father Anchises on his shoulders. He says, my hands are bloody from fighting, so you, father, hold the household gods. So I can't, I've been befouled, so to speak. I need to cleanse myself and purify myself before I can touch these household gods. So you hold them. I'll hold you on my shoulders, and we'll go. And his Ascanius is right by his side, and Creusa, his wife, follows at a distance behind. Now, one question is sometimes posed by people is, why did he let Creusa kind of trail behind and not look back maybe a bit more often, because Creusa ends up dying, right? Now, one reason, I guess the simplest reason, is Creusa has to die for the rest of the story to unfold. Like the Creusa has to die in order for him to be able to start a new race of Trojans combined with Latins in Italy that will form the Roman race. Okay, so he has to marry Lavinia in Italy and found this new race. Now, so that's kind of let's say, a simple reason of story mechanics. I guess the other, let's say, in terms of the level of symbol, is Creusa represents to some extent that aspect of the past that can't be taken with you. So try to remember this epic, more so than the Iliad, is an epic of tradition, of time, and of the history of a people, and how the history of the people has to preserve the past, but some things have to be left behind. Now, so there's a certain element of Rome that's born in Troy and the fall of Troy, but parts of Troy have to be left behind, and Creusa represents a certain aspect of the past that has to be left behind, let's say. Anchises is the past that's carried on our backs, let's say, that we bring with us. Anchises kind of represents that. And he's also leading the future. He's leading Ascanius, his son, who's representing kind of future generations. So there's the past that he can burden and shoulder. There's the future that he can lead and try to found. But there's certain things that he's going to have to leave behind. And there's certain risks in that future, right? So there's the risk of Ascanius dying before his parents' face, before his parents' eyes, as so often happens. So he's got to kind of shield against that risk. So it's a famous scene that here's one example of a work of art that's tried to portray that scene. And we saw in the last slide on the right was another. I'll just go back there. Another amphora of that, ancient amphora of that, and there's been countless representations in art and statues and in references in literary work. So it's in one image, it summarizes to a great extent who Aeneas is. It summarizes Aeneas as man of duty, of piety. It summarizes Aeneas as selflessly looking to the duties to family, to the community represented by the destiny of Rome that he's leading in the future of his child, Ascanius, and the gods. He's ensuring that his father's carrying those household gods. So he has duties to his family, duty to his community, duty to the gods that he carries and burdens on his shoulders.